All right, we will get started. Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Tara Reinhardt. I'm the Director of Special Services in the MSD of Wayne Township. And we are ready for our 340 session and talking about SEL plus equity equals justice for all. I'm going to let Penny and Patrick tell you a little bit about themselves once we get started, but a few housekeeping bits. Everyone will be muted throughout the presentation, so please use the chat feature for any questions that you may have. I will moderate those, and if there's something that we need to jump into, we can. Otherwise, we'll save those for the presenters at the end of the session. We will have a QR code and a link that will give you the opportunity to provide some feedback to us and the presenters so that we make sure next year is even more successful than this year. Now I am pleased to introduce you to Ms. Penny Gregory and Mr. Patrick Jones, who will be discussing SEL plus equity equals justice for all. Take it away.
Thank you, Dr. Reinhardt. Good afternoon, everybody. Excited to be here with you today. We have some things that we want to share with you, and we will just get started here by sort of introducing ourselves. So I'm Penny Gregory. I came to Indianapolis probably about 15 years ago now and started at the Tinley Charter Network Schools. And from there, I taught in IPS and currently serve as the Assistant Director of Special Services here in Wayne Township. I'm also the Fiscal Committee Chair for the Indiana Council of Administrators of Special Education, or ICASE. I proudly serve with that organization. And finally, I am a member and also the Capacity Events Director for a group called Melanated. So I'll let Patrick tell you a little bit about himself and also Melanated.
Absolutely. Thanks, Penny. Patrick Jones, originally from Compton, California. And so I used to work for the Compton Unified School District, where I worked for the district office and taught class there. Also taught private and charter. I was the director, a principal of an all-male middle school. Also was director of secondary schools for that same charter school network. Currently, I serve as the Senior Vice President of Leadership and Equity at the Mind Trust in Center Township. And I am the executive director of Melanated Leaders, which aims to build up leaders of color through community, capacity, and candor, and making sure we provide a space for educators of color to come together, enjoy each other's company, and really hone their skills and craft with each other and among each other to provide that space here in Central Indiana. So I'm grateful to be here. Thank you, Penny, for always working with me and making sure Melanated Leaders gets opportunities to talk about these types of things with educators.
Absolutely. Sorry, there are a lot of dings. And I'm at the waiting room trying to hear it. It doesn't take much to get me distracted. I'm so sorry.
All right.
Okay. So we want to talk a little bit about norms. The conversation we're having today is very personal for me, and I'm trying to fight down the nerves, because anytime you talk about something personal, you have to be vulnerable and you have to be willing to be honest, right? To have a really productive conversation. I'm going to experience some discomfort. I'm going to encourage you to go ahead and experience that discomfort. Some of you will experience discomfort at different levels, and I'm just going to ask you guys to sit in it and sort of evaluate it and see where that's coming from. The other thing is, and we say this here in Wayne Township when we talk about racial equity discussions, is to accept and accept non-closure. So there's going to be unfinished business. There's going to be unanswered questions. Sometimes we walk away from these conversations and we say, what do we do now? How do we change the world? So newsflash, we are not going to end racism today. We're not going to end unequitable practices today, but we are going to have some discussions to make you, hopefully make you start thinking about the way you interact in the spaces that you belong to break down some of these structural things that just sort of hinder our students from learning the best that they can. Listen for understanding and not for judgment. I do that all the time, where it's like, okay, I'm listening to say what I want to say next. And in this conversation, it's really important for you to just kind of listen to understand what we're trying to say in this presentation first, I think, and then process your understanding. Very helpful in these sort of conversations. And then Patrick and I want to make sure that we explain that we're not speaking for the entire race of Black folks. We can't do that. Our experiences are not monolithic. Patrick just got through telling you he's from Compton. I'm from Gary, Indiana, different experiences. His interests, my interests, who we are, although we have some common interests, pretty different. So we want to make sure that we are letting you know I'm speaking from my lived experiences and he's speaking from his, and that's it. Okay?
Absolutely. So one, I think we want to make sure we figure out why and we explain why we're here today. We're here because social emotional learning is a very integral part of what we do. You can't educate a child academically unless you tend to some of their social emotional pieces. But the thing we want to talk about today, as well as that, is how equity plays a role in that. And those two cannot be separated. As SEL can't be separated from academics, equity can't be separated from SEL or any other part of your school functioning and system for that matter. So we want to discuss challenges and solutions to those issues.
Thank you. Okay, so let's understand the challenge. When we talk about our students, when we talk about social emotional learning, and then we talk about the barriers. So we know that our students are ever increasingly more and more diverse, whether it's racial diversity, sexual orientation, whether it's ability, class, gender, however you want to cut it, slice it, think about it. Wherever you are in Indiana, your student population is going to become more and more diverse. And so this conversation is rooted in the idea that even if you do not serve students right now who look differently from you, who worship differently from you, love differently from you, you will eventually. So this is very relevant to everyone on today. SEL is rooted in several competencies, and so we've just kind of outlined it here. Sort of the notion of understanding and managing your emotions, setting and achieving goals, empathy, relationships, and then responsible decision making. And so we have no qualms with that. That's wonderful. Like Patrick just talked about, you cannot just focus on a student's academic ability or his academic achievement or her academic achievement. You really got to think about a student as a whole. And so there is all kind of research to support why we should be practicing SEL in schools and how important these competencies are. It used to be called sort of these soft skills. I think we're coming away from that. We're recognizing that, unless you have these skills, that you cannot sustain success in today's society. The other thing we want to talk about and really sort of scrutinize, if you will, are the barriers. So what happens when you can't implement SEL fully with all students? So we have some things that prevent teachers and adults in schools from reaching students with high quality SEL practices. We want to talk about that. And then we want to examine some ways around those barriers, because where there are barriers, there's always routes to get around that.
Penny, before you move on, I'd love to talk about one thing that we put in there in terms of students. When we looked at race here, notice that we definitely want to center race. When we're talking about SE, especially when we're talking about academic conversations, we want to center race. But when we're talking about SEL, it's extremely important, especially in SEL and other facets of school, but we'll talk about SEL today, to center race, the LGBTQ community, disabled community, class, gender, and underserved communities, because this SEL piece plays into their lived experience in such a dynamic way, because we still live in a society where many of those populations are disenfranchised in school and other facets of our community.
So again, why SEL through an equity lens? When you think about schools, you think of sort of these microcosms of the community, like where you are, who's in your building, represent what's going on in the greater society. And so when you think about being in school and totally divorcing what's happening in the community or what's happening currently in society, you really put yourself, your students, and your student body at a disadvantage. And so when we talk about SEL, and thinking about that through an equity lens, I think about that analogy of putting fish in a dirty fish tank over and over again. So you think about how schools sometimes will implement new programs, something new and shiny, and say, this is how we're going to fix kids. This is how we're going to really work on building community. But if you're putting those programs and those practices and those policies in an already broken system, you're going to get those same results, which is unsuccessful for students and unimpactful. So that's why we have to marry the two, SEL and equity, and really not even saying through an equity lens. Patrick and I talked about this earlier, is really centering that. And so that intersection of equity and SEL, I told you earlier that I was going to be very vulnerable and transparent about something. And so I would say, as I've been working on this presentation, the thing that Patrick and I talked about was making sure that we name the thing, right? And so I think equity, the word equity is very palatable for people. You can say equity and you can talk about, like I have on the screen, every student sort of gets what they need as far as resources, attention, and support. When we think about educational equity, we think about, educational rigor and what they need to be successful that way. When you put SEL and equity together, and in this scenario, educational equity, we're talking about really helping students reach their full potential, not just academically, but socially. But I also want to talk about really, if we center race, then we're talking about anti-racism, right? And so equity plus anti-racism. And I know sometimes it's hard to hear anti-racism. There are a lot of feelings that come up with that. And again, I told you at the beginning, kind of sit with some of that discomfort because we cannot denounce or deny the history of the country that we're in. And so until we name the thing, we can't really work on it in a genuine way. We can just kind of dance around it. We can take all those easier detours. But today in this presentation, we're going to do the hard work. So stick with us.
Thanks, Penny. And that leads us to this quote. So this quote is from Things Fall Apart in Chinua Achebe. And I'm going to give you a couple seconds to read it. But I want you to think about this question while you're reading. This quote is meant to illustrate what happened to the Igbo people in Nigeria. However, what does it mean in terms of SEL and equity? Give us about, I think it takes about 35 seconds to fully read and understand. Okay, so I'm going to read, and then I'm going to bring up a couple of points here that might help us understand here. The white man is very clever. He came quietly with his religion. We were amused at his foolishness and allowed him to stay. Now he has won our brothers, and our clan can no longer act like one. He has put a knife on the things that have held us together, and we have fallen apart. Like Penny said in the previous slide, if we don't name a thing, then we can never get to the place where we need to go. If we don't deal with that dissonance that we know is, hey, there is an issue or there is a reason why some of our kids don't achieve, not just academically, we're talking about once they leave our schools, what happens to them? And we have to ask ourselves, when we walk in and do SEL work in schools, are we taking into account children's whole identities? Or are we saying we need to make sure, if we go back to some of the tactics and some of the techniques we're using, are we saying, do they know how to manage their emotions? Well, manage their emotions in what? Manage their emotions in the society that they currently live in which they are a disenfranchised citizen. That is the 100% truth, meaning SEL alone cannot solve the problem. And if we try to solve the problem with just SEL, it's like us driving a knife in between what we want to happen for our kids and what actually is happening, and they're going to fall apart. Those two will be forever disconnected because we aren't dealing with the whole child.
Thank you, Patrick. And so talking about dealing with the whole child, Dr. Robert Jagers from Castle said this. He posed the question, are we adequately reflecting, cultivating, and leveraging cultural assets and promoting the well-being of youth of color and those from under-resourced backgrounds with our SEL work? And so when you think about the work that you're doing, think about that question. Are we adequately reflecting, cultivating, and leveraging cultural assets? And so that takes away that deficit mindset, and you're thinking about the assets that different cultures brings to your school. So when we think about barriers to how we can implement SEL and equity, again, naming those things, racism, exclusionary practices. When I think about exclusionary practices, Patrick, I think about suspensions, I think about expulsions, I think about over-identification of students in special education. I think about students with labels that hinder them from having a fair shot, even on day one when they enter schools. When we think about educator stress, one thing that we train here in Wayne, we talk about educator burnout is dangerous. It's physically harming, it's emotionally harming. And so managing your stress as an educator is very, very important. But that could be a barrier if not. All of us are stressed currently. All of us are stressed currently. So thinking about ways, that becomes then a barrier for the work that you do with students. And then finally, schools. Just schools. Just the fact that it is a school building in America. And what does that mean to you, Patrick, when I just say schools?
Yeah, it could be any aspect of the school. So, and I think when I think of this, I think of the school as a system. So I think a lot of times when we talk about racism now, and especially in our context, we go immediately to the schools and what we can solve. And the issue with that is if we put the onus on schools, will never actually solve the problem. But we have to understand that the system of school is inherently flawed to address this issue. Just like the judiciary system is inherently flawed to address the issue, just like our capitalistic system as it exists today is inherently flawed in the same way. So we have to understand the system of school, not your particular school, but the system of school and how it is mapped out. Are we interrogating our systems so that we get past some of these barriers in school and not just the particular school? Because I think when we say, if we were to say this particular high school is flawed, then we have to look to the leadership, then we have to look to the specific teachers, but that doesn't really get to the root of the problem. It's not the people, it is the, because we can change the actors and the outcomes will be exactly the same.
And so then we can't deny then the history of schools. When we think about the early 19th and early 20th centuries, and how Horace Mann, who was a reform educator at the time, said, you know what, we need common schools so that we can teach these immigrants, sort of our ways here, because we're afraid that they're going to come here with violence, or they're going to be criminals, or they're going to be angry about this or that other. And so it begins there, right? So that you're centering everything that you're doing around schooling based on your values as this person, your lived experiences, what you think is important. And sadly, a lot of the practices that we still have, specifically when we think about structurally or systems, they haven't changed. And so think about being a child of color, a child who is a part of the LGBTQ plus community, or any of those marginalized groups coming into a building, a system, who expects you to behave a certain way for you to assimilate, for you to adapt, and not being able to meet those needs. Then being told, oh, we have sort of the fix for you, the cure for you, something called SEL. But never addressing really the root of why they feel the unbelongingness, why they feel like the other all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else to add, Patrick?
I think something that comes to mind to me that really illustrates what we're in is actually not a racial issue, but a language issue. And for a country that has no official language, we continue to have a large population of our society that's discriminated against because of the language they speak. In fact, we primarily teach English in our schools without the exception to teach anything else for the most part. And I think that just shows a way in which a system has been created to alienate a group of people based on their ability to, or I want to say their ability, based on them not being able to assimilate language-wise when they first arrive in this country.
I'm so happy you brought up language. We often forget about that group, but my mother is part of that group. You know, I was born in South Korea, and so I witnessed firsthand us further and further behind at achieving sort of this American dream because that her first language wasn't English. So thank you for bringing that to the front. Okay, well, guess what? I know this is going to sound a little hokey pokey, but I truly believe that love recognizes no barriers. It jumps hurdles, it leaps fences, it penetrates walls to arrive at its destination full of hope. And that was Maya Angelou. And so we don't want to sort of message this around no hope, that we don't have things that we can do, that we can be intentional about to really recognize, you know, how do we make this better for our students? And you're on this call because you want to know how to make it better. So now you understand the barriers, you kind of understand, you know, what SEL is and what equity is in this context. So now we're going to talk about how do we move forward.
Absolutely. So when we look at how we can practice and implement SEL, I think we have to look at a couple things. First, we have to look at the broken system of education, or should I say a working perfectly system of education, because it's doing what it was designed to do. It has a history of exclusion and inequity. And the first thing we have to do to fix that is admit that it's there. And so if you're familiar with Singleton's work, one of his models states that I don't know, I don't know. And then, you know, it goes down to like, I know that I know eventually. And so when we look at how we interact with people or how we interact with students to deliver SEL content, you may not know what you may, and we'll get into, I don't want to move too fast, but you may not know some of the things that you're doing that are meant to help children, but actually are very harmful. And so that's something we have to admit first. Admit that we don't know everything, and then try to find out what is the history of exclusionary practices in schools? What is the history of inequity in schools, and how do they continue to play out today? The next is understanding things from a macro level context. And understanding how we're perpetuating the damage that is done to underserved students. And then really digging into the idea of spirit murdering by Dr. Bettina Love. And I'll have Penny talk about that more, but I think, and one thing that we all have to admit in this room, or at least I'll start, I'll be the leader here and have somebody else be the first follower, but I'm guilty of all these things. I'm guilty of holding a broken system. I'm guilty of not understanding the macro level context from the micro context. I'm guilty of spirit murdering children and understanding that, hey, I want to do great for this student and I want to be a champion for this student, but end up taking away that student's dream, life, and love at the same time I'm trying to do good, which brings us to intent versus outcomes. What is our intent? What do we want to do for students, and what type of actual outcome are we getting?
Yep. Penny? So are we complicit in the injustice? I know we talk about implicit bias a lot. I kind of don't want to dwell there because I think it gives us all an out, right? Oh, well, I don't know, I'm being biased. It just happens, you know? So I think we need to admit it and recognize it and deal with it. But we also need to understand that we can be intentional about how we show up in the world and how we interact with our students so that we're not spirit murdering, so that we are uplifting and that we are putting them and situating them in their day in a way that they always feel seen, they always feel important, they always feel like they belong. And so thinking about SEL in that context, how do we provide justice for all of our kids in the work that we do that's also enriching them and not viewing them as something is wrong or something that needs to be fixed? And we always say we're not in the business of fixing anybody. You know, we're here to, if anything, we're here to sort of help their roots to grow.
You got this one, Penny?
I got it. So how can we practice and implement SEL to ensure that it does not cause harm? Again, cause harm. Think about that. So we have some common SEL practices on the left, and then sort of the racial equity incongruence on the right. And these are things that, again, if we talk about guilt, you know, I hate to even use that word, but I will say that we're probably all somewhat complicit in doing this. So thinking about commenting positively on student appearance, you're not thinking anything negative about that. You're just saying, hey, you know, I like this, or I noticed this. But you got to think about the racial equity incongruence. So do you know enough about how student appearance is perceived in their community, how hair is perceived, weight, color, jewelry? And so there are norms. I heard someone on an earlier presentation, and there's amazing presentation today, and someone said earlier, you know, they talked about how families in one's, for instance, Wayne Township families, if you've met one Wayne Township family, you've met one Wayne Township family. And so families are sort of societies all in themselves. And so when you think about a whole community and how many different norms there could exist there, think about how much you would have to learn about a student and their community and their norms before you can make one of these personal comments. I think about, you know, growing up in Gary and how many times people said, oh, you have good hair. You know, and so then if I have good hair, what does that mean about, you know, my friend's hair next to me that's different from mine? Oh, you have your so somehow that you know that sets me apart. I think they meant it in a good way, and it always made me feel like I didn't quite belong. Wasn't quite enough Black, wasn't quite enough Korean, wasn't quite enough something or another, right? So thinking about, you don't know everything there is to know about someone until you take the time to know it. And then Patrick, I know this is something you and I have talked a whole lot about, because Patrick will often comment on how he's not the stereotypical or typical Black man. People want him to show up a certain way, and that's just not who he is. And how, you know, that's a journey to kind of accept yourself for who you are, whether that's a stereotype or not. So thinking about dress, musical ability, articulation, even thinking about, you know, things like that single story that, you know, black guys are supposed to play sports or rap. My son is now probably 6'1", and I don't care where we go, there's always someone who says, you know, assume he plays basketball or assume he's into sports. Patrick Jones used to be my son's principal. He will tell you he is nowhere near a sports fan. My son, he will read a book all day long, and he will, you know, he'll paint something, but he's not into sports. As a matter of fact, my son won't even wear sports gear because he doesn't want someone to say, oh, that's your team? Tell me a little bit about your team. He don't know. So, you know, just understanding that there's a danger in that single story of what you think someone should be. And so always kind of thinking about that trigger, that stereotype threat that could happen if you make those comments, not thinking anything of it, but not knowing enough about someone. Patrick?
Yeah, I mean, I can't add any more to that. That's perfect. When you do that, it's definitely dangerous. And then you have to ask yourself, what do students think when they walk into spaces and those things are expected of them? Then there's a cognitive dissonance between here's who I am, here's who people want me to be, and a person that young having to make that decision about who they're going to be based on your expectations for who they are individually.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to dig into this, and we're hopefully, you know, those of you who are very familiar with SEL and the SEL competencies, that word always a tongue twister for me, you will see very clearly how, you know, we've sort of highlighted the equity elaborations. And again, this is Dr. Robert Jager's work and his team out of Castle. And so we've put these resources in the presentation for you to have later. But when we talk about SEL, one of the competencies is self-awareness, right? But what we're saying in our presentation is that must also include racial, class, and gendered identities. So very much like what we just got through talking about, you know, if we're teaching students how to be self-aware, but we're not calling out, appreciating, uplifting who they are racially, who they are in their community, and who they identify as, then we are not really teaching self-awareness. So then this becomes one of those things where SEL is not reaching all students?
Self-management. And I think that that's definitely one thing we want to focus on at SEL. But what we can't forget to imagine here is that it must include collective agency. Are we helping students cope with acculturative stress? Are we helping them cope with cumulative anger? Are we helping them cope with discrimination and prejudice? We have to understand when children come into our space, they're not just angry at what may have happened in that moment. Their anger is encompassing a lifetime. What happened in that moment may have triggered something that have happened before, but remember, they're walking around with their trauma, the trauma of their parents and the trauma of their parents' parents. And that is what is walking into the space with them, not what happened in that moment. And so then how are we really engaging into what that means? And the last comment I want to make, Penny, I'm sorry, is, and that goes with this slide and the previous slide, the way to get to some of those things is having conversations, but the way you have those conversations and build that trust is everything. And so we want to do it with humility. And a lot of people think they may be doing with humility, but what that actually means is when you're humble enough to have those conversations and engage in trust with those students, you are actually adjusting your station in life for that moment. Right. You're adjusting your station in order to be curious enough to figure out where that student is coming from. You're just adjusting just for that moment so you can figure out what is happening in that moment and what has happened in moments prior to that.
Thank you. My computer just let me know that my internet connection is unstable. I'm not sure if I'm freezing or not, but Patrick, let me know if I'm frozen, and definitely let me know if it's an ugly face that I'm frozen in. Okay, so social awareness. I've been trying to articulate this to a friend of mine for a long time and did not really understand what I was trying to say fully. And because it wasn't as if there was someone using the N-word, right? It wasn't someone waving around any sort of overt racism or overt bigotry. But there was this idea that there is no place that's safe in this space. And so thinking about how do we center belonging and social awareness, it's not just about being someplace, it's also about everyone connecting in a way that I feel like I also belong here, that I'm a part of a bigger picture. Patrick, I didn't tell you this earlier, but I wanted you to talk about a little bit about how you created belonging at Tinley Prep, because I think that's why a lot of young men thrive there. And it wasn't just because, you know, they were in a school that sort of had high expectations for them, but when they walked through the door, that was their place. So can you talk about, even if you think, when I think about your morning routines, or, you know, like not breaking the chain, or how you know, promoted kids socially, not just academically in the building, I think those real life examples might help some of the educators on.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one, I would love to acknowledge here first that was version 1.0 of what it could be, and know that it wasn't perfect, and there has to be a version 2.0 of that where I take some other things into consideration, and a version 3.0 where I do the same. But I would say Penny's right. There were things that we did that built definite community in the space. One of them was a morning meeting between the whole school or grade level every day. And schools of different sizes have trouble with this. So some schools do it in classrooms. We did it in the hallways of every school. So you imagine 100 boys in one hallway, about 100 in another, 150 in another, and really trying to tap into their emotional state. We felt that to be important in our space. And so we had a scholars creed that the students said every day in unison. We also had a teacher's creed that the teachers said in unison. And I think the beauty of that there, and understanding how young men needed the opportunity to lead, if the scholars weren't saying the creed in the right way, the teachers had the ability to ask them to do it again. But conversely, if the teachers did not say it in the right way and the students felt like the enthusiasm wasn't there from the teachers, they for sure had the ability and the right to demand from the teachers that they gave them their all that morning. And so I think that little exchange there provided an opportunity for students to not only exist in the space, but to lead in the space and showcase their leadership. They also had the ability to give advice during the day. We also had a leadership program there named Sons of Light, of which actually Penny's son was a member. And they had to go through a board's certification process to become a Son of Light. But after they got in, they led the school in different fashions. So if there was a distinguished person coming to the school, if there was a task to be done, I didn't have to do it alone. I had the Sons of Light with me who were effectively a part of the leadership structure in the school. So when the mayor came to the school, I did not greet the mayor. I did not walk the mayor around the school. I did not talk to the mayor. They literally gave a PowerPoint presentation to the mayor to describe our school and what we did there. It was their responsibility to do so. We also had meetings every Friday that affirmed, the whole purpose of the meeting was to affirm young men for what they did during the week. And so we wanted to make sure that they felt great about coming to school. Now, we are dealing with children, so it wasn't always true. So we definitely had to dig deep and find those conversations. But once again, being 100% transparent and honest, if I were to go to version 2.0, I would say we had too many suspensions at that school. And I would have to find a way to have conversations that brought kids down and really understood them. While I thought we did a great job from an identity perspective, we did not do a great job from a de-escalation perspective when young men did not buy into the system for whatever reason. A lot of young men opted in and maybe sometimes when they first got in with us did not, but then ended up winning their way over. But if I lost one out of not being able to de-escalate, it was too many.
Yeah. Thank you for those examples. And I will say that, I've seen some great examples of community building around like just, and we'll get to that slide in a minute. But I think when we think about belonging, I think about community building. So thank you. So relationship skills, centered in collaboration. So you think about how do we teach students? I think thinking about teaching academically is always the easy part. We, as teachers, as educators, we get it. We got to teach you ABCs. We got to teach you 1, 2, 3s. But how do we teach students, how to collaborate? How do we teach them how to sort of demonstrate this cultural competence? And oftentimes we hear cultural competence and we think about adults, but we should also think about students. How do we teach students cultural competence? What does that mean in your classroom for your students? Let's break those words down. Also leveraging cultural fluency. I heard someone on an earlier meeting talking about, if your social group is homogenous, you might need to rethink some of that. You might need to think about, how do I include people in my inner circle who don't look like me? And so when you think about that, that's that cultural fluency, being able to be a part of different communities fluently and not feel as if you're the other because you have personal experiences with that group. Anything else here, Patrick?
Yeah, I think, one thing I think about that, especially when we talk about belonging and this right here, this idea of cultural fluency, reminds me of this story. I can't remember the researcher's name, but he tells the story of humans being in the forest. And when you're in the forest and there are trees all around you, animals all around you, you feel pretty much, especially when it becomes nighttime, you feel like you're in danger. And so what do humans do when they feel in danger and they're trapped in that forest? They start cutting down the trees. Because we got to clear land, because we got to make sure we can see the sun. So you cut down the trees and you move the animals out of the way and you make the space habitable for you. But what you don't understand is around you, what you did when you cut down the trees is you destroyed all the other life cycles around you. And so when we have to leverage cultural fluency and we talk about belonging and we want to make sure that we can start having conversations with other people and understand their cultures, we can't continuously cut down the trees around us to do that. Sometimes the trees have been cut down for us, right? When I moved to Indiana, this is the most homogeneous place I've lived in my entire life. And so when I walked in, the first thing I said, honestly, Penny, was, my goodness, I've never lived with so many white people in my entire life, because I haven't. And I went to a high school where there were no white teachers. I went to a middle school where there were no white teachers, Black and Latino teachers all the way through. But one of the things I had to do was become culturally fluent very quickly in order to exist in this space. I couldn't chop down the trees.
Right. All right.
Responsible decision-making, focusing on distributive justice. So when we look at this, we want to make sure we consider considering diversity, salience, and climate, and making sure that we understand who's all involved in the process of making things, let's just say, happen, assessing the impact on one's beliefs. And I want to land there for just a second. One thing that we've ruminated on at the Mind Trust is understanding that not every team is going to make an equitable decision, and not every person is going to make an equitable decision. So one system that we're looking at putting in place is, should we have a protocol for especially large decision making? If we're going to choose a vendor, have we gone through the process? If we're going to choose hire a new individual, have we gone through the process? And we have to understand that when we don't put those processes in place, then we make decisions that we've always made, and those things don't get us to the justice that we're looking for. And so we already have hiring processes in place, but do they allow for us to make sure that we have enough candidates of color in the situation? Or we already have opportunities to, or we already have situations where kids are going to be suspended, or conversations are going to be had with kids about removing them from the classroom. But have we had conversations like 20 children of color have already been removed from this classroom? So the conversation is not with the kids anymore. The conversation is with the educator, and we need to find out what the root cause of that is. We need to really interrogate why this keeps happening so we can make sure we get to racial and equitable justice for our children.
Okay. Okay, so really quickly, because we're going to get into all of these, but SEL practices that can center equity. So let's start thinking about, what can we do tomorrow when we think about the lessons that we are all creating, whether we're in our office, we're saying brick and click, whether we're brick and mortar or we're clicking a computer, SEL practices are still very much important. We still need to connect. And so thinking about cultural integration, racial, ethnic identity development, integrating equity context, and also community building.
Mm.
Okay, so cultural integration. So again, just thinking about that idea that we are looking at assets. Every single, student in your classroom, every family that's represented is an asset to you, whether you are comfortable with who they are or not. And so thinking about how do you connect their culture and their identity to the work that you're doing in the classroom. So I know that Zaretta Hammond, who wrote Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain, she talks about, 3 levels of this cultural responsiveness. And so you can be surface, you can be shallow, or you can be sort of deep, and you're going to go deep. So when we're talking about culture integration, we're not just talking about, we're going to have a soul food day. I think it's great to celebrate cultures and what is definitely part of cultures, but I think going deeper into that and thinking about your curriculum, does that encourage, students to appreciate and be proud about their lives? Also, does it encourage them to reflect and examine their lives? Does it make them think about social justice through discourse in the classroom, rooted in who they are, in their community, in their race? And so I don't remember having any of those kind of conversations when I was in elementary, middle, or high school. I don't think I've had those conversations. I had those conversations until college. And so really thinking about how do we get deeper into the cultural integration and not just a surface.
Well, actually, this will be one of the solutions later, but a researcher named Dr. Muhammad, she actually just published a lot on this work and talking about students not only seeing the reflection of themselves in the curriculum, but also attending to this idea of criticality and knowing that stereotypically, folks think that Black people just need to see themselves. That's one thing, but also identifying how the curriculum reflects themselves in the space. That's the most important thing. Why is this important to me in the space? And a lot of time as educators, the first thing we say to a student who asks that question is, you just need to do it anyway.
Yeah, yeah. This is you, Mr. Jones.
Thank you so much. Promoting racial, ethnic identity development. Examine your background, your experiences, your perspectives. Express your background and create space for your students to do the absolute
I know you are
same.
passionate about this.
Listen, so this is the thing I believe in most, and many. I work in public education and have except with the exception of 4 years, my whole career. But I sent my own children from ages 3 to 9 to a private school down the street from Tabernacle Church in Center Township, Indianapolis. And the reason why I did so unapologetically was because that school promoted Black excellence in their curriculum. And I wanted my own children to have the ability to explore their ethnic background without question in the first and formative years of their life, because there are just so many negative images of Black folks and what Black people can be and do in our society. I wanted them to have another message. I'm going to say this, and I'm going to hurt some Beehive members' feelings here, but Beyonce is just not a common name in my house. And it's not because I don't like Beyonce. It is because Beyonce to me is just not as important as the Hidden Figures ladies. Beyonce to me is not important as St. Elmo Brady. She's not as important as Mansa Musa. She's not as important as Martin Luther King Jr. She's not as important as Fannie Lee Hamer. These are the people that my children need to understand and understand how to emulate to, because I need them to understand where they come from before Beyonce came. Who were the people that paved the way for Beyonce, and how can they understand excellence in this household? Because what the TV is telling them is we're going to argue in nail salons and hair shops, is that we're going to be in restaurants throwing wine on each other, and we're just not doing that. So we also have to understand that our identity is wrapped up into how we behave and how we see the world. And we have to do a better job of schools of helping children understand who they are, where they come from, and how they should represent themselves in the space when they come to school. It has a lot to do with how their racial and ethnic identity has been developed.
I think you're going to have to go ahead and relocate, because the Beehive is going to come for you.
They are, but we all right.
Okay. All right. So, Patrick, I'm looking at the time and I cannot believe it's already 4:30. So we're going to have to get a move on here.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And Dr. Reinhardt will let us know as we're getting closer. So here's another SEL practice that can center equity, integrate equity context into academic and social subject areas. So I always hear Dr. Reinhardt and her, the SEL coaches here in Wayne talk about, SEL can't be, a lesson that we do, a 30-minute fun time that we just, something extra on our plate to do, is actually something that we integrate in all of our academic and social subject areas. And so then as we're thinking about equity or racial equity, we're also thinking about studying historical examples of conflict, injustice, discrimination, to teach tolerance, social skills, and civic responsibility. Examine teaching practices and classroom climate, because like Patrick said earlier, it's not just what you teach, it's how you teach it. So if you are teaching those things in an environment that doesn't feel safe, or not one that doesn't feel authentic, then oftentimes you won't get the participation that you need for this to really stick with your students and become a part of your classroom culture and climate. Patrick touched on this a little bit. about classroom and community building, but here are just some other examples. I really love the fact that you talked about teacher-student affirmations already, Patrick. We talked about, the idea of a balanced discipline strategy in the absence of over suspension and over expulsion. What does that mean for students to have a voice in sort of how they are delivered discipline? Because discipline is teaching, right? Discipline is not punishment. So how do teachers have students have a voice in that? How do they have sort of agency to talk about, what is acceptable here? And then when I do something that doesn't meet your expectation, then do I have a voice in, what does that then discipline look like? And I know that's far from traditional thinking about schools, but we are far from traditional days. And so we need to rethink and examine how we're disciplining students.
I'm gonna say this real quick, Penny. One, somebody in the chat asked, how can we do this identity work in every school? My answer in the chat is we operate as if history occurred in one place at any given time. But when things were happening in ancient Greece, things were also happening in other places of the world. Take, for example, the Greek scholars. So one of the things we can understand what was happening in the African world at the time. Another thing to understand is Greek scholars also went to the libraries in Egypt and Northern Africa to get educated. Then the last thing I would say is another thing you can do for practice are visible or visual anchors, and understanding that children love to be affirmed, and doing that visibly is one way to do it. So at the school, what we also did is when you were student of the week, you got a fat gold chain and you got to wear it every single day at school. And young men absolutely loved it. I actually had somebody come to my school and say, that's horrible that they're wearing a chain because chains are represented. Chains are a sort of symbol of slavery. And it's amazing that that person's mind went there, because my children and I had no sense of slavery when we created this, because actually it was created by a child. He was Scholar of the Week and he was wearing a chain in school. I said, hey, why are you wearing that? And he said, I should be able to wear it because I'm Scholar of the Week. I said, you know what? You're right. What do you want to do about that? And so this child and I created a system where we had a gold chain, we painted it gold, and every time somebody won Scholar of the Week, they wore it. And so our mind did not go to slavery when we thought about this chain. Our mind actually went to hip hop and the culture that the kids were involved in, and saying, this is something that we want to wear our bling when we do something great.
Mm-hmm. Okay, this is perfect timing. So we want to leave you with questions. That's right, not answers. We want to leave you with questions, things to think about. First question, how can I differentiate my instruction to weave SEL into our entire day? That is something that is going to take some intentionality and some thought. Where are my students coming from? Where are they coming from? Not just their neighborhoods, but their hearts, their minds, how they're processing things, how they're viewing things. Where are they coming from? Are you taking the time to get to know that? Patrick?
Yeah, have I looked closely at the books on my shelves? And so I think this is something that we're trying to leave you with questions, but I think this is something we got to give people tools for. So one, I mentioned the work of Goldie Muhammad, and in our resources, we have a link to an interview that she did explaining how we can build culturally and historically responsive literacy classes, and understanding this idea of criticality. Her research is really interesting. She went back and looked at the historic literary societies of Black America after slavery, and really honed in on what they believed in and what they understood to be true for literature to be really important for Black people. So her work is really interesting. And then the last thing I wanted to put in there was a way for you to audit your classrooms, your classroom libraries, so you can ensure that your books are representative of your students who are in the class. And so there's also a link to a classroom library questionnaire, so you can start to interrogate what you're doing with your classroom libraries.
Perfect, thank you. Have I examined the strategies and phrases used in my instruction? So this is all about pedagogy.
Mm-hmm.
how do I relate to my students and colleagues? And so this is going to require you to ask some really hard questions of yourself, but also maybe of your students and your colleagues. Oftentimes that feedback could be hard to hear, but how do you, again, start to work on the way to fix things or to improve things if you don't know where the problems lie? So maybe asking those questions. I know, some of the teachers that I think about who had the most success in spaces where kids look different from them were the teachers who were authentically themselves. They weren't trying to be something they weren't. They weren't trying to use, vernacular that wasn't familiar to them just to be the cool teacher. And as a matter of fact, that's very harming practice. But to be themselves, but also be relatable. So we're all humans and we can relate to one another. We have to ask those questions. And then where might there be some systemic barriers? One of the researchers, and I can't remember her name right now, who works with Dr. Robert Jagers over at Castle, said this as she travels the United States, that where Black and brown kids exist and SEL is implemented, it's about remediation, saving Black and brown kids from themselves. It's compliance. When she goes to more privileged schools and communities, it's about college and career readiness and enhancement. It's about those skills, those lifelong skills. So thinking about, why are we doing it? Why are we implementing SEL? And then thinking about, are there systemic barriers or systemic racist influences that's causing us to not meet the needs of our students? And so I will leave you with that as my final thought. Patrick, what's your final thought?
Yeah, I think this is highly important, what you're talking about, especially when we're talking about the systemic barriers for anybody in the principal seat, anybody in a teacher leadership seat, and then, what you can advocate for in the teacher seat. And so understanding that the way we get over this is to interrogate these systems. And the only way to do that is to step from beyond them and understand that, hey, I'm a part of this. So then every time I try to address it, I'm actually going to be acting from the area of defending it, because I can't appropriately see that it's a problem. So I have to step back and say, well, what if I didn't work at this school? Or what if I didn't lead this system? Then would this be equitable for whoever, my own children? Or is this equitable for this group of children? What is happening to this group of children after they leave? And really be courageous in asking those questions of ourselves, and then asking, Penny, why? And why? And why? Until we get to the point where it feels uncomfortable for us to really answer the question.
Yes.
All right, our time has come to an end. So Patrick and Penny, we really appreciate all of the content you've delivered and shared with us today. We did have one question that's still left unanswered. Do you have a list of young adult books that you would suggest to start these conversations with in our advisory period with our students? The staff is reading a book, but I want something that is student relatable.
There are lots of books. What age group are we talking about? Did they say?
Advisory, so I'm assuming secondary.
Yeah, high school or such.
7th, yeah. Middle school.
Yep. So in our resources, there are links to literature. And then I would say, we have our email addresses here. I could send something. I hate to just call, one or two authors, but I remember, The Eye of the Tiger was an excellent book for my daughter. She got into that, and that was around, like social issues. And so if you have students who are into like social issues and injustice, that might be something for them. But I think it's on interest level. And so it's hard to just, again, we're not monolithic, right? So what one student might like, another one might not. So it's kind of getting to know your students first and then polling them. What do you fancy? And then coming back and having the conversation. There's plenty of Black authors of color, wonderful materials out there. I follow a ton of authors on Twitter just to see what's new out there, so they can also access that.
Wonderful. They're putting lots of great ideas in. Also, I would say if you're interested in having further conversation, Penny and Patrick have listed their email address there, so you can contact them individually. And we just appreciate it. I did put the link to the feedback form because I know that they would really appreciate that feedback. We would appreciate the feedback for having even a better year next year when we have the symposium. And we'll look forward to seeing you in the next session. And then finally, the panel, which is around equity and SEL integration. So we'll have some further conversation during that time around the same topic. Have a wonderful day. And again, thank you to both of you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate you.